Amen. I know that there are some people here who are new to this message this evening, and perhaps there are some people who haven't been studying these truths for very long. So this evening I wanted to just take an opportunity to just really do an introductory study so that we could see some of the reason behind the models and the ideas and the concepts that we use to develop end-time prophecy. Most of us are familiar that we're required to study the books of Daniel and Revelation. You've all been to Daniel and Revelation seminars. But there are many things both in those two books and in the other books of the Bible that we can apply and use judiciously at the end of the world to understand what's happening today and what's about to happen in the near future. So we'll begin our thoughts in Revelation chapter 10. We'll begin from verse 1. And I saw another mighty angel come down from heaven, clothed with a cloud, and a rainbow was upon his head, and his face was as it were the sun, and his feet as pillars of fire. And he had in his hand a little book open, and he set his right foot upon the sea, and his left foot on the earth, and cried with a loud voice, as when a lion roareth. And when he had cried, 7 thunders uttered their voices. So it's this theme of 7 thunders that we want to just spend a few moments looking at. If we were to go to manuscript 59, 1900, if you have a study Bible, it's actually in there. Ellen White's going to tell us a few things about chapter 10. It's MS 59, 1900. She's going to tell us that this angel that comes down to earth is no less a personage than Jesus Christ. I'm not sure what each of us think that actually means, if we actually think Jesus came down in Revelation 10, or whether it's a symbol of something that's happening here on earth in connection to the work of God. So I'm quite happy for people to be interactive. So my understanding is that Jesus didn't come down on earth. This is not Jesus. This is a symbol of Jesus. How do we know that? How do we know it has to be a symbol? How big is Jesus? I mean, if he's the same size he was when he left Earth, maybe 6 foot, 6'1", 2", not sure. Perhaps a bit smaller. So, okay, I'm happy to concede the point, but he wasn't that big, and unless he's grown, which he may have done over 2,000 years, I don't think he's grown enough to get 1 foot that can stand on the land and 1 foot that can stretch all the way across the oceans into various parts of the world. So, verse 2, I was quoting verse 2, and he had in his hand a little book open, and he set his right foot upon the sea and his left foot on the earth. So if you see what Ellen White's commentary on that short statement is, she explains it in two different ways. One of the ways she explains what that symbol means is that Christ is stretching all across the earth. Do you understand that? If this was the earth, there would be 1 foot here, and let me check if I'm going to do that the right way round. And, he had his right foot upon the sea and his left foot on the earth, so that's correct. So here's the sea, and his right foot is here. I'm not going to read the Spirit of Prophecy quote because we're quite familiar with, many of us are, of what that passage means. So I think we're all familiar that the symbology of the 2 feet is symbolizing a worldwide message. We understand that? Yeah. What else does it symbolize? Because it symbolizes something else. I'll read it to you just in case we're not familiar with it. The mighty angel who instructed John was no less a personage than Jesus Christ, setting his right foot on the sea and his left upon the dry land, showing the part which he is acting in the closing scenes of the great controversy with Satan. So, one thing that it teaches us, this position is what? It's dealing with the closing scenes of the great controversy. So, it's dealing with the end of the world. Do we agree with that? And then it says, the position denotes his supreme power and authority over the whole earth. So not only is it a symbol of the end of the world, what is it also a symbol of? His superiority over the whole earth. So it's symbolizing two things. His superiority over the whole earth and something that's going to happen at the end of the world. So if you combine those two thoughts together, it's showing that Jesus is going to begin to position himself, taking a position of authority over the whole earth at the end of the world. So when you start thinking about all of that symbology, you know that this is not really Jesus coming down to earth. You would agree with that? Okay. So if it's not Jesus coming down over the whole earth, who is it? Okay? So it's a symbol of his people, because his people are what? Scattered all over the earth. We're not localized in one place. Now we can understand these symbols in a number of different ways. If we're talking about the end of the world, where would we mark that? We could mark it in a couple of different places. If we were to go to Daniel chapter 11, which are the final scenes that are going to happen on earth at the end of the world, particularly the last 6 verses, and we know that because if you go to the next chapter, Daniel chapter 12 verse 1, it speaks of Michael, who is a symbol of Jesus, standing up, and Ellen White clearly teaches us that that Bible verse, Daniel 12:1, is a symbol of the close of probation, or we might call the general close of probation for all humanity. So the verses that precede that are dealing with a subject that's at the end of the world. And how do we know that? Because if you went to Daniel chapter 12 verse 1, how does it begin? It says, and at that time. And we can understand that time in a number of different ways, but if we were going to look at it contextually, I will suggest the first thing that you need to do is go and find some time that's being referred to. And the first place that you're going to go to if you're going to see some time is Daniel 11 verse 40. You can see that? If you've turned to those Bible verses. So if I were to draw that as a line, we'd have here Daniel 12:1, and we'd have Daniel 11 verse 40. And in Daniel 11 verse 40, it's called the time. And in Daniel 12:1 it says, that time. And I submit to you that the time that's being dealt with in Daniel 12:1 is the same time that's being dealt with in Daniel 11 verse 40. In Daniel 11 verse 40 it talks about not just time, but it says the time of the end. So what would that be the end of? It's all dealing with this history here, the end of the world. So you know that Revelation chapter 10 is connected with Daniel chapter 11. Can see the connection? It's the time of the end. This is showing his supreme authority that he's doing at the end of the world. Now, there's much that we could understand about this passage. One thing that we should understand about Daniel 11 verse 40 is that the time of the end is a singular point here, and it also covers a time period. So if I were to put it as time of the end, it can be understood in two separate ways. If we were to study verse 40 in any great depth, and most of us already have, we could demonstrate that Daniel 11 verse 40, this time of the end, is in fact the end of a time prophecy. In fact, it's not just the end of a singular time prophecy, it's the end of two time prophecies. And those two time prophecies are the 2520 and the 1260 and another one. Would it be the 1335? No, yeah, it's the 1290. And that's a bit of a trick because the 1260 is really just a component of the 2520. And all these time prophecies that end at this point here are all shown on this chart. If you were to go through this chart, you'd see the numbers here. You've got the 1290, you've got the 2520 up the top here, and if you dug through it, you'd see the 1260. Just here. So, if you do the number crunching of these time prophecies, this would take you to 1798. So from 1798, we've entered into the last portions of Earth's history. And as soon as we get to this history, now Christ is going to begin to do a work where he's going to begin to show his supreme authority over the world. Now, I want to suggest that the symbology here in Revelation 10 isn't actually occurring in 1798. It's sometime later than that. And we're not going to go through the study to demonstrate and prove what that is. But I think most of us understand that it's a few years down the road, 42 years in fact, and it takes you to the year 1840. So in the year 1840, Jesus is going to take his position across the earth at the end of the world, and he's going to begin to show his supreme authority. So when we begin to think about what's happening here, we understand that from 1798 begins the creation, if you like, if you could express it that way, of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Now, we could refine that concept in some degree if we were to go to Revelation chapter 2 and Revelation chapter 3. Because in those two chapters, we have the story of the Church of God on earth, don't we? And it's described through 7 periods of time, or 7 dispensations. By the time you get to 1798, you're going from the transition of the 4th dispensation into the 5th and then into the 6th dispensation of God's church, eventually landing you in the last dispensation, which is Laodicea, 7th and last dispensation, which is the dispensation of Adventism. So if 1798 brought you from the 4th into the 5th, you know that this history here, the history of the time of the end, takes you from the 4th into the 5th, the 6th, and the 7th church, the 3 dispensations of the Church of God here on earth, until you get to the time of the end, where Michael's going to stand up and probation's going to close for God's people, in fact for everybody on earth. Now, if we were to study Daniel 11 verse 40, it's slightly more complex than I've portrayed it, and I'm sure we all realise that, because here we can begin to see that it's not only the year 1798 that Daniel 11 verse 40 is referring to, where the Pope is taken captive by Napoleon Bonaparte's general Berthier, 1798, and the deadly wound is struck upon the papacy, and it essentially goes into obscurity, because that verse teaches more than that. It also teaches events that are occurring in 1989 at the end of the world. Now, if you're not familiar with these prophetic studies, or if you've never read Daniel 11 verse 40 carefully and are not familiar with the symbology of the whole chapter, the jump to get from 1798 to 1989 is a leap of faith, to say the least. The most of us know how to do that. You have to go from 1798 to 1989, and the logic that we employ to do that. Does anybody not know? I'm not going to go through it. I just want to know, just to get a feel. Obviously, if people are new, they wouldn't know how to do that. Does everyone else know how to jump in the verse, Daniel 11 verse 40, to get from 1798 to 1989? Yeah? Sorry?
Part B.
Part B, yeah. We can divide the verse into 2 parts. So, if we have time tomorrow, and if there's an interest, maybe we'll do that, because it's one of the most important verses that we really need to understand as we're going to approach end-time prophecy. If we don't get that straightened out, many of the things that we need to understand aren't really set on a firm foundation. So what I want us to see is that we can take these verses from verse 40 to verse 1, chapter 12, all the way from 1798 to the end of the world. But we can also look at those same verses in a different way. We can actually begin them not in 1798 but in 1989, because verse 40 stretches quite a vast period of time. In fact, verse 40 still hasn't been completed. We're still actually in verse 40. The work that's going on in those words, in that verse, haven't been completed. Maybe we should just read verse 40. Again, I'm not going to spend the time to explain it, but it's well worth reading the verse. And at the time of the end shall the king of the south push at him, and the king of the north shall come against him like a whirlwind, with chariots and with horsemen and with many ships, and he shall enter into the countries and shall overflow and pass over. That work of overflowing and passing over hasn't quite reached its culmination, although it's well in progress. So we would begin verse 40 in 1989, and so from 1989 to when Michael stands up, which is imminent, is really dealing with end-time prophecy. If that were the case, then the year 1840, which is what's being portrayed here, this is Revelation chapter 10, if we remember, and this is the year 1840. It begins in the year 1840 and goes all the way to the year 1844. It covers a 4-year period of time, that chapter. We would need to go back into that chapter and understand how we would apply it at the end of the world in a post-1989 time period. And we can do that. And the way we would do that would be through typology or symbology, saying the same thing in different ways. So we'd look at the symbols that are being portrayed here, the events that surround those symbols, and see how we could apply them at the end of the world. And what's the primary marker that we use in this chapter to locate the year 1840? The first thing that we do is we see the relationship between chapter 10 and what? Do we know? Chapter 9. We'd go to chapter 9. And we see that there's a relationship between 9 and 10. They need to be joined together. And if we were to do a careful study of chapter 9, we would see that the primary focus as you get to the end of that chapter is dealing with the fall of radical Islam. And if you went through the history that Daniel chapter 9 is teaching, and Daniel chapter 9 is portrayed in this chart, the 1843 chart, sorry, Revelation chapter 9, thank you, and this chart, the 1850 chart, by the symbols here, these two horsemen, from both charts. It's clearer to see on this chart, they're a lot bigger. And if you read it, it says the Mohammedans, and it talks about the Ottoman Empire ceasing its supremacy. So we know that there's a work of Islam here in Revelation chapter 9. And if we were to read and study that chart carefully, it would take us to the year 1840. And 1840 takes us from Revelation 9 into Revelation 10 when this angel comes down, and that's why we mark this as 1840. So there's a connection between the history that's portrayed here in Revelation 10 in the year 1840 with the work of Islam. And if we were to read the words here, it says, the Ottoman supremacy ceased. So all I want to pick up from that is that in some shape or form, the work or the role of Islam stops. Now we know the work of Islam didn't stop in 1840, because if you read the newspapers today, you'll see that it's picked up a pace, to say the least. So we would know that the work of Islam hasn't stopped here or ceased as it's portrayed in the chart, but it was actually halted for a period of time, or we might use the word restrained. And what we want to understand in this history here, that the restraining of Islam is connected with world wars. Now, in 1840, the world is a lot smaller than it is today. I don't mean that the earth has grown, obviously, but I mean when we think about the world and the countries that are the major players in the world is a lot smaller. Primarily, what would the world consist of in the year 1840? It really is focusing upon Europe. We could make an argument about the United States, but the only reason we, as Adventists, would make the argument about the United States is because, well, we're in America for one thing, and we're headquartered here in the United States. We understand the United States is the land that was given to this church, God's people, and the Bible calls it the glorious land. But in 1840, the United States isn't really much of anything, really. It's still a two-bit country, if we could say it in such an insulting fashion. But Europe is the place. Europe is the center of the world. And the restraining of Islam here is dealing with the interaction between Islam and the world, or Europe. So we want to understand that connection, that what's happening here in 1840 is the connection between two superpowers, if we could express it that way. One superpower, Islam, isn't really that super. It's waning in its power, and it wants to rise up and regain its lost supremacy. But Europe is a superpower, but it too is beginning to wax and wane in its authority. And that's where the point that my sister begins to come up, that America begins to take the leading role of the superpower. I'm not saying specifically in 1840, but as the decades move on, you're going to see a shift or a transfer in power. But in 1840, it's the then known world is struggling with an emerging, radicalized Islamic power that is threatening to do it harm. So when you think about this story here, and we know that Jesus has his foot on the earth and on the sea, we know this isn't a real Jesus, yes? We know these aren't real feet, yes? Is this real water? So it's not real water, is it? And is this real land? No, it's not. Okay, so it's all symbolic. Now, if we were to go to Revelation 13:11, Revelation 13:11, you could turn there and read it. I'll paraphrase as you read in your Bibles. You'll see a power that's going to come out of the earth. And when Ellen White comments that this power that's coming out of the earth, she's going to identify this power as the United States. But if we go 11 verses back, you're going to see another power, another beast. And this beast is coming out of what? Sea. So you can see land and sea right there in Revelation 13. And I would suggest that the land and the sea that's being portrayed in Revelation 13 is the same land and sea that's being portrayed here in Revelation 10. Revelation 13, that land or that earth is nothing more than the United States. We all agree with that, don't we? This two-horned beast that is a lamb, or as a lamb, will soon begin to speak as a dragon. But there's another beast, as we've said in verses 1 and onward, that comes up out of the sea. It's the same concept or idea that we could see in Daniel chapter 7, where there's a striving of the sea and beasts come out. So if we were to go to Revelation chapter 17, we could begin to see, let's go to Revelation 17 in fact. Revelation 17, begin at verse 1, but it's not verse 1 that I want to read. And there came one of the 7 angels which had the 7 vials and talked with me, saying unto me, Come hither, and I will show unto thee the judgment of the great whore that sitteth upon many waters. So I would suggest that those waters are the same seas that are introduced in Revelation 13 and Revelation 10. Seas or waters. So this whore is sitting on waters. So right here, this foot that's going to do what? Stand upon the sea. What's on the sea in Revelation 17? What is on the sea? A whore. So there's this whore sitting on the sea, and what's Jesus about to do? Crush her. With whom the kings of the earth have committed fornication, and the inhabitants of the earth have been made drunk with the wine of her fornication. So I would suggest, if we read these two verses, verses 1 and 2 contextually, it says, many waters, and in verse 2 it says, with whom the kings of the earth have committed fornication. Who have they committed fornication with? With the whore of verse 1. So he carried me away in the spirit into the wilderness, and I saw a woman sit upon a scarlet-coloured beast, full of the names of blasphemy, having 7 heads and 10 horns. In verse 1, where is the whore sitting? On the waters. In verse 3, it's not called a whore now, it's called a woman. And where's she sitting? On a beast. So what's that teaching us? That these waters or the sea are? This is the beast. Hopefully we can see that. So here's the beast. we could go to Revelation chapter 17 carefully, but we're not going to because of lack of time. And we could see the existence of this beast and this whore, we can time quite accurately. And we'll just do it this way. Verse 3, which we already read. He carried me away in the wilderness, and I saw a woman sit upon a scarlet-coloured beast. So this beast is scarlet-coloured. Verse 4, the woman was arrayed in purple and scarlet, and decked with gold and precious stones. And in verse 5, her name is Mystery Babylon. So if you were to put all of that symbology together, we could develop correctly an understanding that this beast is nothing more than the history of the Dark Ages of the 1260. Here, this 1260 is this beast that the woman sits on, that God, through this symbology, is about to crush. So, if this is the beast of the 1260, where is the 1260 located geographically? This is Europe, isn't it? Yeah? So we know that the seas, the multitudes, the kings, in the plural, are all a symbol of Europe. So let me take this out here. So this is Europe. And we've already identified that the land or the earth of Revelation 13 and Revelation 10 is the United States. Now, the United States are not really in existence in this history where we're dealing with the 1260. The 1260 is this history that precedes 1798. But the United States begins to rise to the ascendancy post 1798. In fact, Ellen White says that explicitly. She'll tell you as a nation was going down, another nation begins to rise up. And what nation was going down in 1798? France. France was heading down and America was rising up. So you see there's this transition between France and the United States, and they have a very close relationship with each other, prophetically speaking. So here we have the United States. And so we know that the United States is going to begin to arise to the ascendancy. It begins it begins life as a lamb, then begins what? Life as a dragon. We were to go to Revelation 12. What was the dragon a symbol of? Satan. So you know that this lamb-like gentle beast, the United States, is going to develop and change or morph into a satanic power. When it begins to develop into this satanic power, what is God in this symbology going to do? Step on it. Now, we saw that this woman was sitting on this beast in this history. Now, if we were to run through the whole of Revelation 17, we would see that when she was sitting on Europe here in the Dark Ages, in the 1260 period, the last person that she was in a relationship with were most of the Hungarian Empire, if I can use it loosely in that phrase. And Napoleon is going to go and destroy or crush all of her bedfellows, all of her partners, because she's a whore, remember. The kings of the earth have slept with her. And Napoleon's going to destroy and decimate that relationship that she's having with those European kings. And in doing so, he also is going to sever his relationship with her. So there she is, sitting like a widow, and she's looking for a new partner. And all the Europeans have rejected her. Because the Europeans have become what? They were all religionists, if I can use that, but now they've become atheist or secularized. They've all become secularized. So she needs to find a good Christian partner. And where's she going to go? She's going to go to the United States, nice young man. So she's going to literally go over the seas and now go to the United States. And then she begins to enter into an affair with this man. She's going to begin to take control of the relationship, and then she will do what? Like she sat on them, she'll begin to do what? She'll begin to sit on the United States. Now she's quite clever, and when she sits, she's not going to do the work herself to begin with. Because in verse 5, not only is she called a whore in the previous verses, but now she's called a mother. If she's a mother, she has children. And the identification of her children is in that verse. They're called harlots. And I would suggest a harlot is a female prostitute. So she has daughters, not just children, any old children, they're daughters. And one of those daughters ends up becoming the Protestant churches of the United States. So she's not going to sit on this land to begin with. She's going to get one of her daughters to begin to do the work. So this woman here, first is one of her daughters, Protestant America, and then the mother takes over. But I'll just symbolize it here by the one woman. But this foot here is going to crush her. So in Revelation 10, when it talks about Jesus coming down from heaven with these 2 feet, showing his supreme authority that he's going to begin to exhibit at the end of the world, it begins way back at the beginning of our church's history, in the time period spanning the 4th church into the 5th church and on. And the 4th church is called what? Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, Laodicea. What's interesting about those last 3 churches, unlike all the previous churches, is that they don't span hundreds of years. They actually coexist, or at least they are alive for a very short amount of time period. So I'm going to put 5, 6, and 7 all together here. And this is Millerite history. I'll put it up here. 1798 to 1844. So all I want us to see is that the 3 churches all begin to develop and exist in the history of the Millerites. And by the time you get to 1844, we transition from the Advent movement to the Advent Church, or Seventh-day Adventists. And that's where we take our roots from 1844. We could develop an argument to show that Laodicea perhaps comes into existence after 1844, maybe into 1850. But for our study, I'm just placing it in 1844. So here you've got 1798 and 1844 and the 1260. So you've got all the dynamics here that are being portrayed in Revelation 10. Jesus is going to begin to take control of the situation, and he's going to crush this woman. Can we see how he did it here in the past? Yes? He used human agencies to do that work, didn't he? Who was the premier agency that he used? Napoleon, France, to do his work. But who else did he use in that history? It wasn't just Islam. France, it was Islam. So here we've got radical Islam. It was being used in this history to do a work on behalf of God. So you had 2 powers. So this foot here is being symbolized by whom? Just at the level that we're speaking of. I don't know if you caught that. The first one was, well, if we do it in order, we'll do what my brother said, Islam. And the second one is France. Can we see that? France and Islam are going to be used to destroy this relationship between the church and the governments here. So you can see that the same thing's going to happen over here. Same dynamics are going to happen. As this relationship's going on, there's going to be a work that's carried on that this foot will do here at the end of the world. Now, I've already identified that this history here, the fourth church, is the history that's being portrayed here, where France and Islam begin to do a work to punish the papacy or Rome. But then, once that destruction or the breakdown of that relationship occurs, who's going to take over? The United States. The United States enters into a relationship with the papacy. And it did so at a very early age. Right at the very beginning of the creation of the United States, the papacy began to maneuver itself and to begin to take over what often people call Protestant America. Now, I don't know why Adventists still consider the United States as being Protestant America, because we should know better. We really should know better. Because to argue that would say this: if we had the Sunday law, and this Sunday law is the national Sunday law in the United States, and we were to go to 1989 and 1798 and 1844 and 2017, if we still think that this land is Protestant America, we need to ask ourselves, what models are we really developing? Because if that's the case, when does this nation fully submit itself to the papacy? If you go back and begin to identify the history that's occurring all the way through here, it will take you not only to Revelation 9 that we've discussed, Revelation 10 that we've discussed, Revelation 12 that we've discussed, Revelation 13 that we've discussed, and Revelation 17 that we've discussed, but it would also take us to Revelation 14. And we all know that Revelation 14 is the three angels' messages. And the three angels' messages came into effect, or began to do their work, in the same history that we're dealing with here, at the end of the world, the time of the end. So, perhaps one of the most famous verses in the Bible, if you're an Adventist at least, maybe even here at the end of the world, is Revelation 14 verse 8. Babylon is fallen. Everybody's familiar with that phrase. Not many people understand what it means, because it's in relation to the next few verses, verses 9 to 11, where it talks about the mark of the beast. But we as Adventists understand what the mark of the beast is, don't we? Yeah? It's the mark of Rome's authority. That it can change laws and direct governments to do its will. Isn't that the mark of its authority? Yeah? It's not any old laws. No, there's specific laws that it wants to deal with, and we understand it's the Sunday law. But Revelation 14 verse 8, this phrase, Babylon is fallen, is not just some future event, is it? That phrase, that verse was fulfilled way back over 100 years ago. In fact, it was fulfilled in this history here. Revelation 14 verse 8. In fact, not only was verse 8 fulfilled in that history, but Revelation 14, 6 and 7 was also fulfilled in that history. And if you had the first angel fulfilled and the second angel fulfilled, it shouldn't be a surprise to you that the third angel was also fulfilled in that history. So in that history, when a pronouncement was made that Babylon has fallen, what was that talking about? We should be able to go onto Wikipedia, Britannica, any encyclopedia that you wanted to go to, or Adventist history, or a Bible commentary that dealt with the history of this time period from 1798 up to 1844. We should be able to go and find out when was this phrase, Babylon is fallen, used, and why was it used, and against whom was it levied. And we know in our movement, and I think our church has really forgotten, that this statement here was levelled against the Protestant churches of the United States. So the Protestant churches of the United States began to fall. Or should we say, had fallen. Because when did they really begin to fall? Why, back here in 1798. 1798, slow but methodically, over 46 years, they began to slip further and further away from God, out of his hand, into the hand of the papacy. I want us to understand that in 1798, Protestant America was God's church. And what was its name? If we think about this symbology here, its name was Sardis. Because what had the Protestants done? They'd escaped Europe and entered into the United States. And what was the name of the whore that lived in Europe? Revelation 17 verse 5. Babylon. So I would suggest that Europe was the country or the nation or the empire of Babylon, ruled by Babylon. And God's church are going to do what? Come out of Babylon and go where? Into the United States. And it therefore shouldn't surprise us that the word Sardis here, this fifth church, means to come out. So I want us to see one thing that's really important here in 1798. There's a call to come out of Babylon. In 1798, there's a call to come out of Babylon at the time of the end. And when it says come out of Babylon, who's supposed to come out of Babylon anyway? God's people. Someone said something. Who said that? I didn't hear what they said. The Jews. God's people. So come out of Babylon, my people. Have we heard that phrase before? Where's it found? Revelation 18 verse 4. Come out of her, my people. Where are God's people in this history? In Europe, in Babylon. And they need to come out of Babylon and move to the glorious land, don't they? The glorious land is the United States. So if we were to think about Old Testament stories, we know a history that says God's people, through disobedience, through rebellion, were taken captive by the Babylonians, ruled by King Nebuchadnezzar, taken to the land of the Chaldeans, and after 1260 years, after 70 years, what are they required to do? Come out of Babylon, my people. I want us to see two things by this. One of them is that God's people are where? In Babylon. Are they Babylon? Have they begun to dress like Babylonians? After 70 years, you'd begin to. Do you begin to think like Babylonians? After 70 years, you would do. Would the way you construct your houses be of a Babylonian style? Because you like their architectural styles. Of course it would. And the way that Babylonians run their streets, by the way, they have these streets that look like this. I don't know what you call them. You might call them, I guess that's a duplex, maybe. From where I am, if you have houses all joined together, they're called terraced houses. Or, what do you call them here? Apartments, although even if they're houses. So they're all connected together. So that's how the Babylonians used to put their houses together. And God's people began to like that kind of style of architecture. So when they came out, they used to follow that same idea. And so it's no wonder that we love living in the cities where we're all crammed up close together, because all of these ideas are Babylonian ideas. So there's a call to come out of Babylon, and it's important for us to understand this, that here at the time of the end, God's people are in Babylon and they're required to come out, but they're not Babylon. So I want us to get that point. You can begin to see where hopefully this is going to begin to direct us. I made one point here. This was the 1260. But there's another history that I just mentioned a moment ago, which was the 70-year captivity by Nebuchadnezzar into Babylon. We're all familiar with that history. Yes? Ellen White will tie these two histories together, and there's a nice Bible quote, a Spirit Prophecy quote that does that. It's actually in those prophetic keys. If you take the time to dig it out, you could find it. So they're going to come out of Babylon. And when they come out of Babylon, there's a power that's going to allow them to do that. And what is that power that's going to allow them to do that? Because this is Babylon, and if you go here, what comes after Babylon? Media Persia. So we're all familiar with that, yes? So I'll put here B for Babylon and MP for Media Persia. So the Mede and Persians are going to allow God's people to begin to come out of Babylon. They give them freedom. Yes? So what nation have we got here in 1798? The United States. What power have we got here? Mede Persia. So let's go to Daniel chapter 8. Before we read the verses from Daniel chapter 8, I just want to remind us, Revelation 13:11. I'll put it here. Revelation 13:11 says, I saw a beast. What kind of beast was it? What kind of beast was it? Not where it came from. Who's going to shout out what kind of a beast it is? Like a lamb. So it's a beast with two horns, but it's like a lamb. I want us to see that. And what is a lamb? What kind of animal is a lamb? It's a sheep. It's a baby sheep. Okay? So here we have, I'll draw it here. Here's our sheep. Two horns. We're in Daniel chapter 8. Verse 3. Then I lifted up mine eyes and saw, and behold, there stood before the river a ram. Do we know what a ram is? That's also a sheep as well. Fully matured sheep. Not a baby sheep like this one, it's the mature sheep. Reading on in the verse, and it had two horns as well. And let's read verse 20. And the ram which thou sawest, having two horns, are the kings of Media and Persia. So here we have a sheep which has got two horns. So can you see that the sheep with two horns back here thousands of years ago was nothing more than a parable or a symbol of this sheep with two horns here at the end of the world? They're the same power. They're the same dynamics, because this power is going to allow God's people to come out of Babylon. Revelation 18 verse 4. They're in Babylon for 70 years. They're held captive by Babylon. But here, at the end of the world, God's people are being held captive, not for 70 years, but for 1260 years. And where they're being held captive in Babylon, in Europe, by Mystery Babylon. Revelation 17 verse 5. So I want us to see that we've got a history here in the Old Testament that doesn't just span one book. It's not just the book of Daniel, because it covers the book of Daniel, covers the book of Ezekiel, covers the book of Jeremiah, covers the book of Isaiah, and it covers most, if not all, of the minor prophets and others. Ezra, Nehemiah. In fact, most of the Old Testament, besides the Pentateuch, the 5 books of Moses, and a couple of other books, like Kings and Chronicles, most of the back end of the Old Testament, all of that's covering is essentially this history. A little bit afterwards and a little bit before. But that's what most of the Old Testament is covering. So you know that this history here, that the Lord has spent many, many books describing and explaining to us, has a close connection to end-time prophecy. And this should inspire us to read the Old Testament afresh, to go back into those stories and try to understand how we can draw from those symbols a prophetic meaning that we can understand here at the end of the world. And you can see that I've done that relatively simply. Taken the 70-year captivity by Babylon, they are released by the Medo Persians. The Medo Persians are a sheep with two horns, and it's the identical scenario here in 1798. Mystery Babylon has held God's people captive, not for 70 years, but for 1260 years. They were in the wilderness here, Revelation 12. They were in the wilderness here because they weren't in their own land for 70 years. And now they're going to be led free or set free from Babylon. They're going to move to the glorious land. The Medes and Persians are going to allow them to go back to their own country, which is the glorious land. They're going to come out of Babylon. It's my people that are going to be doing that. Same history here and the same history here. And it has to have been that the United States was portrayed as a sheep with two horns. And this concept about the Medes and Persians and the United States being typified as a sheep with two horns has a profound effect on end-time prophecy when you begin to read other passages in the scriptures that we're not addressing now, especially in the studies that many of us here have come to understand, where we begin to relate Persian kings with the presidents of the United States. So you've seen presentations done on that, where we're going to go into Daniel chapter 1, verses 1 to 4, and we begin to line up Persian kings with American presidents. The logic behind that, the reasoning behind that is surprisingly simple. It's all based upon two countries with two horns, which are symbolized as sheep, which do a work of rescuing God's people. That's what role they had. They rescued God's people here, and they rescued God's people here. I'll show you the verse where they rescued God's people here. This is Revelation chapter 12. I'll leave it for you to go and study the verses out. But just to give you the verse that you need to look at, it's Revelation 12:16. So this would be Revelation 12:16, where you can see that the United States is going to lend a helping hand to God's people in the same way that the Medo-Persians are going to lend a helping hand to God's people. The dynamics between these two histories are so closely connected, it's a wonder that we've never spotted it until very recently. It's a wonder, because it's been staring us in the face for so long. And when you see how easy it is to see that connection, I always think, how comes I didn't see that? And I've read these verses for years. How comes I missed that? And why did I miss that? Is it because I don't study hard enough? Is it because I'm not clever? Sorry? Because it's not time yet. It's not time. And all I want us to say in closing about not time is that everything happens in God's time. So when it's in God's order that He would feed us His word, if we're willing to open our mouths and be fed, when He says be fed, He will do that work for us. So when we sort of kick ourselves thinking, it was so obvious, we shouldn't. If we are in tune with God and we've got our mouths open like little chicks waiting to be fed, screaming at Him, at the right time He will feed us. So in due time, He taught us that this sheep is the same as this sheep. So I just want to summarize. Revelation chapter 10 is teaching us about the work of Christ. It's not a real Christ, it's a symbol of Christ. It's a work that's going to happen at the end of the world, showing His supreme authority. And the people who run the world today, if you want to call them the globalists or the New World Order or the threefold union, Dragon, the Beast and the False Prophet, it's a connection between Rome, the Church of Rome, and the kings of the earth. So when Jesus is going to show His supreme authority, you know He's going to go head to head with that alliance, with that confederacy. And that's what Revelation chapter 10 is teaching us. He has one foot upon the land, one on the sea. One upon the United States, one upon the kings of the earth. In history, this was Europe. In the 1260, this woman was riding Europe like she owned the place, because she did. When she did that, she brought bloodshed and carnage to God's people. Why? Because we were in rebellion to God. He was punishing us through this empire. When that work had been done, and she took one step too far, God got His foot and crushed her. Then the work began in the United States. That work in the United States hasn't reached its complete fulfillment, but it began to do its work way back here in Millerite history, because this wasn't the woman, it was the daughter. And when that daughter began to try to ride the United States, here in the year 1844, God just gave her a mini squash. Didn't totally annihilate her, because He wanted things to develop still. Because He still needs to deal with the mother. So this woman, this daughter, is going to go into a relationship with her mother, and this work is still to be completed, where God is going to crush this woman. But I want us to see that this history here, where Jesus crushed this European confederacy, was only a type of something that's still about to happen at the end of the world. Daniel 11, verse 40, begins in 1798. It takes you all the way to Daniel 12:1, these last few verses of the book of Daniel 11. We're still in Daniel chapter 11, verse 40. This is the period of the time of the end. I've not shown you how you can go from 1798 to 1989, but you can. Once you make that jump, then what you can begin to see is in this history here, where Jesus began to exhibit his supreme authority over Europe and the United States, in this history that was just before 1798, but we'll take it to 1798 and to 1844, this 46-year history is being portrayed here in this imagery. It's about to be repeated at the end of the world as we come to 1989 and onward. But before he can begin to do anything, what does he want us to do? He wants us to come out of Babylon. Because if you still remain in Babylon, when he begins to crush Babylon, what will happen to you? You'll get crushed with him. There's a call for God's people to come out of Babylon here in 1989, as it was here in 1798. In 1798, Babylon was Europe. Here, back in the year 536, this was literal Babylon. But God's people had built their homes here. They had settled in that land. And you know what? We never really lost the bug. We've remained in Babylon in so many ways right through history, especially during these 1260. So guess what? Back here in 1989, where do you think God's people are? We're in Babylon. We're not Babylon, but we're in Babylon. And before God can begin to do a work of destroying Babylon, the first thing he wants to do is rescue us so that we don't get caught in the crossfire. That's the theme of end-time prophecy. It begins with a call that God wants to rescue his people who are in bondage to Satan and his satanic kingdom here on earth. And then, once that work is done, the Lord will begin to take control, as he shows us here in Revelation 10, where he's going to destroy and crush the satanic empire here on earth. And it shouldn't be any surprise that the satanic empire at the end of the world is focused, is situated in Europe and the United States, as these two centers control the whole world. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we thank you for your goodness and mercy. Lord, as we hear the call that you're still making over 2 decades from when you began to make that call for us to come out of Babylon, Lord, if any of us know brothers or sisters who are still wrapped up in that system, may you give us the wisdom, the courage, and the words to speak to them, that we might pull them out of that fire. Lord, we thank you that we bowed before you are already out of that system. We kneel before you, Lord, with great joy as we enter into a Sabbath day. A day, Lord, that you created, not that it was designed and crafted by satanic powers. We know, Lord, that you have taken us out of captivity, that we can be free men. Please be with us and please bless us over this weekend as we begin to open and study your word in the freedoms that this fair country affords us. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.